Okay, so let's rewind 20 or 30, 60, whatever, years ago. You're a baby, lying in your parents' arms. Ah, look at your cute baby beanie. What rosy cheeks, etc., whatever. Your parents are, well, pretty normal. They work a lot of the time, and that work takes them from home. When they're home, sometimes they're a little stressed out, or hey, maybe they're tired, and that makes them a little short with you. They might love you a lot, but they don't always show it. Children are basically big sponges, and one of the best ways they have to learn about the way the world works is through their interactions with their parents. Those early interactions then create a lot of assumptions about what their future relationships will look like. And those expectations and assumptions can have a major impact, not just on our childhood, but in our lives today as adults. This idea is the foundation of attachment theory, which was initially developed by a British psychoanalyst named John Bowlby. So today we're going to learn about attachment theory, what the different kinds of attachment are, and what all this means for our lives today as adults. So Bowlby was trying to understand the intense discomfort experienced by children who had been separated from their parents. His theory was that this wasn't just some kind of an immature temper tantrum, but was actually an adaptive response to being separated from what became known as a primary attachment figure. To understand the purpose of attachment, it's helpful for us to take a look at other animals. Take horses or gazelles, for example, who can stand and walk, even run, just hours after being born. By comparison, a human baby is basically a big larva. It's just kind of a sensing organ that has no real ability to interact with the world in an effective way, and certainly no ability to survive outside of its parents. For a child, particularly one born thousands of years ago, separation from their parents was effectively a death sentence. What this means is that the babies that survived to pass on genes, that passed on genes, that eventually led to us today, were the ones that were able to form a strong and secure bond with a primary attachment figure. As an aside, this is also probably why specific parts of our brain light up when we're exposed to pictures of particularly cute things, particularly cute babies. We're literally hardwired to care about cute things, which makes us more likely to protect them from harm. So don't worry, there's an evolutionary reason that you share all of those cute cat pictures. So getting back to Bowlby, he thought that some kind of motivational system must have evolved to regulate the child's proximity to their caregiver. A colleague of Bowlby's named Mary Ainsworth began to systematically study this system, and she took a look at the behavior of 12-month-olds when they were separated from their parents. The babies would be with their parents in a room for a while, then the parents would leave, then the parents would return. And researchers took a look at the behavior of the babies while all of this happened. The experiment became known as the strange situation, and it's one of the most well-known experiments ever conducted in the social sciences. So in the strange situation, about 60% of the kids behaved more or less the way that you would expect. They were comfortable with the parent when the parent was around. When the parent left, they became anxious. And when the parent returned, they were pretty easily soothed. These children are securely attached. About 20% of the kids were fussy even before they were separated from their parent. When the parent left, they became absolutely distraught, and when the parent returned, they were very, very hard to soothe. It was almost like the baby was trying to punish the parent for leaving. These children are anxiously attached. And then about 20% of the children, the last 20%, didn't really seem that bothered when the parent left. And when the parent returned, they would sometimes even turn their attention from the parent to start to play with objects that were on the ground. These children are avoidantly attached. So attachment can be broken into two big categories, secure and insecure. Then inside of insecure, there are all of these other ways to break up those categories. The two that I've explained so far are avoidant and anxious. To get you a little bit more comfortable with the language, anxious is sometimes also referred to as anxious ambivalent or anxious preoccupied in adults. Avoidant is also known as dismissive avoidant. And then there's kind of this fourth attachment style that's been identified in adults, Fearful avoidant. Fearful avoidant is also sometimes known as a disorganized attachment style, and people with this attachment style have elements of both anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. They're simultaneously hyper-aware of threats and expect to be let down by other people, while also really craving intimacy even as they push it away. So yeah, that one's bit of a bummer. One of Ainsworth's critical findings was that the sensitivity of the child's attachment style, wasn't entirely innate. Instead, it was heavily based on the sensitivity the parents showed toward their child, essentially how responsive they were to the child's needs. Children who appeared secure came from families where, yeah, things weren't perfect, but in general, the parents were pretty responsive to them. On the other hand, insecure children often came from families where the parents were not that attentive to the needs of the child, maybe even neglectful. Generally speaking, what's been shown over and over in the research literature on attachment is the sensitivity of the parent really matters. And this actually also shows up in the research on trauma in childhood as well. There's even some research that argues that neglect, particularly cases of extreme neglect, are actually worse for a child's development than being physically abused. All of this means that, simply put, your attachment style is not your fault. Most of our paradigms of attachment are formed in childhood, and as children, we're largely victims of our circumstances. But unfortunately, how that system develops in childhood has a really long cascading effect into how many of our adult relationships play out. Okay, so let's take a moment to kind of go through each of the major attachment paradigms, and as we're doing this, you can kind of play along in your head. Do any of these maybe sound a little bit like you? Securely attached adults tend to trust their long-term relationships. They also tend to have reasonably high self-esteem, they seek out social support, and they enjoy their intimate relationships. A really important part of this is that securely attached adults tend to feel more comfortable sharing their emotions with other people. Moving on to anxious attachment, anxiously attached adults tend to be uncomfortable with too much closeness, but they might also be worried that their partner doesn't really love them. They might themselves seem kind of cold and distant on the one hand, while also complaining that their partner isn't warm enough to them. This can lead to a lot of struggles and even a lot of breakups, both in terms of romantic and friendly relationships. And when breakups do happen, anxiously attached adults tend to become extremely distraught. Moving on to avoidant attachment, avoidantly attached adults tend to have a lot of problems with emotional intimacy. They try not to get overly attached or overly invested in their relationships. And maybe related to this, they tend to report lower levels of sexual satisfaction inside of those relationships. But at the same time, they're also more likely to engage in casual physical relationships with other people. They might struggle to trust other people or to share their true feelings. And it's pretty common for them to break things off if their partner starts to get too close to them, or if they start to feel too invested in the relationship. Then fearful attachment styles, oh joy, these people tend to manifest behaviors that are both anxious and avoidant. They might seek out really deep emotional relationships, even intensely pursuing them. But then when they finally get them, they might withdraw and become disinterested all of a sudden. When things are going really well, when they feel really safe, when there's a lot of emotional intimacy, they might suddenly start to sabotage the relationship and look for reasons to be discontent inside of it. Part of this is because they tend to have a lot of negative views of themselves, and they don't really feel worthy on a fundamental level of receiving the love and support from other people. I want to take a moment here to highlight that these are big, fuzzy, really vague categories. Just because you have a certain attachment style doesn't mean that you are always going to behave in line with it. Humans are really complicated, and just because you have some tendencies from one of these groups doesn't mean you don't have tendencies from the other groups as well. To use myself as an example, again, I was pretty securely attached with my family, but I felt pretty anxious around other kids. I had a lot of experiences of feeling not included, even disregarded or unloved by other children at school. I think over time this created more of an anxious attachment style with my peer group, and I still struggle with some of those tendencies today. By the way, this is increasingly validated by research. There's some really interesting research that's come out that's shown that people can have different kinds of attachment styles with different sorts of groups of people. Okay, so what can we do about any of this? First, it's really important to get a sense of what our individual attachment style is. Again, these are families of tendencies. And if we have problematic tendencies, the first step is going to be, well, recognizing that those tendencies are a problem. Then when we recognize them, we can actually start to do something about them. One way to do this is by looking back over different kinds of relationships that you've had, maybe breaking them up into 3 big categories: your family relationships, your relationships socially with friends, and then finally your romantic relationships. Are there tendencies that you have inside of each of these categories? Are there problems that keep coming up over and over again? That can be a really good indicator for what form of attachment style you have. Then second, once we've identified what the issues are and what our primary attachment style is, we can start exposing ourselves in small, safe ways to our deeper fears. To oversimplify a bit, insecure attachment is driven by 2 different kinds of fear. For anxiously attached people, the fear is that they will be abandoned and left without support. For avoidant people, the fear is that if they get their hopes up, they'll be disappointed yet again. And those 2 deep fears drive all kinds of different problematic behaviors at the surface level. If you'd like to learn a bit more about this, you can check out my recent video focused on meeting your needs. Once we realize what those deep core fears are, we become a lot better at watching the mind as it's working. Through different kinds of mindfulness practice, it's possible to develop a kind of attention for the functioning of your brain. When we start to recognize what our deeper fears are, it becomes a lot easier to watch those fears as they begin to arise in the mind. This is kind of the purpose of a lot of different mindfulness practices. You develop a sort of attention for the functioning of the mind as it's working. And we can start to notice those fears appear as we interact with other people socially. This is really important because it allows us to start disidentifying with the fear. You are not the fear. The fear is something that your brain is doing to you. And once we get that separation, it becomes so much more possible for us to take small, safe risks where we push against that fear in different kinds of ways. One way to do this is by running different kinds of little social experiments, where you expose yourself to something a little bit uncomfortable, and then you watch the voice of fear appear in the mind as it tells you the same thing that it's told you all those other times. How people don't like you and they won't support you and you can't trust them, and if you get too close, they're just going to hurt you again. And then you have a choice. You can listen to the fear or you can act a little bit differently. You can take the risk of relying on a friend a little bit more than you might have before. You can take the risk of being more expressive with your emotions to other people. You can reach out for support when you might not have otherwise, or work on trusting yourself that things are really going to be okay even if they don't text you back right away. Of course, try to place good bets and do it with people that you think are safe. And if those bets go well, really highlight in your mind that things worked out. Focus on them. Take them in and really permit yourself to be changed by them. Allow yourself to expand that comfort zone a little bit at a time. Maybe most importantly, remind yourself that you didn't need to listen to the fear. So that's it for today. I hope this video helped you get a better understanding of attachment theory, where it comes from, why it's important, and hey, maybe what your attachment style is as well. When we start to recognize those tendencies in ourselves, it becomes so much easier to start to correct them. Until next time, thanks for watching.